Hello and welcome again to the Gospel of Luke. We're in our 8th session today, and I'm here again with Father David Norris, who is the Director of Chaplaincy Ministry for the Diocese of Fresno and the sacramental priest serving the community of St. Paul Catholic Newman Center here in Fresno. Also, we have Dr. Robert Maldonado, a professor at California State University, Fresno for the past 22 years, and someone who has served the diocese many, many years as our biblical scholar on many programs here at KNXT. I wonder, as we begin with chapter 6, verse 43, before getting into that text, if we have anything that would be good, Robert, to understand the bigger picture of what we're doing with Luke.
Well, one of the things that Luke is doing is writing for a Roman audience, and Luke himself seems to have been educated, a little higher class social status person, that's speaking to people for whom giving alms, helping the poor are not ideas that were certainly major in the ethics of the Roman Empire. It was much more, you did any good, it was much more of a bargain. There was always the question, it was among peers, and so you might help somebody else, but it was almost always with what would be the potential payback. And so last week we saw quite a bit of ethics that Luke is recommending, or Jesus is recommending, and this is something that's kind of foreign. In the Jewish tradition, there was always a concern for the poor, so that didn't have to really be argued for by Jesus. But Luke actually has to really hammer it in a way. And so I think it's important to just remind the audience that Luke is speaking to a very different audience than Jesus was, and trying to get this Roman audience to see that there's value in not expecting a return, to have concrete actions that benefit the other, and
which is a good message, I think, in our contemporary society. Luke is probably on the money with us in our society today, in our consumer culture. Robert, a test of goodness, what do we have there?
For no good tree bears bad fruit, nor again does a bad tree bear good fruit, for each tree is known by its own fruit. For figs are not gathered from thorns, nor are grapes picked from a bramble bush. A good man out of the good treasure of his heart produces good, and the evil man out of his evil treasure produces evil. For out of the abundance of his heart his mouth speaks. Why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I tell you? Everyone who comes to me and hears my words and does them, I will show you what he is like. He is like a man building a house who dug deep and laid the foundation upon rock, and when a flood arose, the stream broke against that house and could not shake it because it had been well built. But he who hears and does not do them is like a man who built a house on the ground without foundation, against which the stream broke and immediately fell, and the ruin of that house was great.
What do we have here to unpack? These are not necessarily passages that we use all the time. They don't come up in our lectionary on Sunday, but I wonder what message there still would be totally relevant, I'm sure, for today. Father David or Robert, what do we want?
Well, I like the follow-up on this challenging message that Jesus is giving. He says, by their fruits you will know them. And that's always the question of the gospel. I look at the scripture texts more from the point of view of a preacher, and what am I going to deliver as a homily. And that's always a question that we leave at the end of any time of worship and prayer. What does our faith produce? Does it produce any good? Does it come out in actions of compassion or in generosity? As Robert said earlier, are we acting out of the goodness of our hearts, or are we looking for some kind of prestige or honor, or looking to get something back? There's a difference between charity and investment. If I'm doing something out of charity, out of love, I'm not looking to get something back from it. And I think that's a very important comment here. And the test of goodness is what is being produced by our religious acts, or by our behaviors. Is it really affecting the good of others, out of that sense of the centrality, again, of love that is at the heart of the gospel?
And I think, it's in a sense you could say, well, a good tree could produce bad fruit, But in another sense, if it actually does produce bad fruit, then it's a bad tree. and until it produces good fruit, it's a bad tree. And so the fruit test, I guess, is really the, as Father David was saying. And also the sort of ending of that initial test of goodness, why do you call me Lord, Lord, and not do what I tell you? I think that relates right back to the teaching just immediately preceding from last week, where be merciful as your Father in heaven is merciful. And so sort of the imitation of God, how does God treat people? How does God favor? Does God expect payback? God is the God of the widows, the orphans, and the poor. And so here that has shifted from the imitation of God to the imitation of Christ. And I think that's a kind of nice link between the two teachings as well.
One single verse that is unique to Luke in what was read today in this program is only this one verse. For out of the abundance of the heart, his mouth speaks. Luke put that in with the text that Matthew had already given him that he probably knew about and worked with, or at least it's out there. But this is unique. For out of the abundance of his heart, his mouth speaks. This is the idea, I think, that for Luke, it's a matter of everything is based on love, it's on mercy, it's on kindness, it's on social justice, it's on taking care, but it's not out of the head, it's out of the heart.
But that's for both. So it's both the good and the evil man have an abundance of their heart, and I think Luke is contrasting the good, right? The good person is going to have that energy, the abundance of the heart, resulting in good, whereas the evil one is going to have the energy of their heart resulting in really great evil. And that's exactly what's going to happen in the next passage with the building of the house. The good one builds a great house that stands, and the bad one builds a really bad house that suffers great ruin. And so I think, again, these sharp contrasts between sort of the good and the bad, the haves and the have-not, the prudent and the imprudent are being drawn by Luke here.
All out of the heart. Father David, can you share this story called The Centurion Slave? Very, very beautiful story, and we have a lot of comments, I'm sure, after you read it.
From the beginning of chapter 7. After he had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. Now a centurion had a slave who was dear to him, who was sick and at the point of death. When he heard of Jesus, he sent to him elders of the Jews, asking him to come and heal his slave. And when they came to Jesus, they besought him earnestly, saying, He is worthy to have you do this for him, for he loves our nation, and he built us our synagogue. And Jesus went with them. When he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to him, saying, Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore I did not presume to come to you, but say the word and let my servant be healed. For I am a man set under authority, with soldiers under me, and I say to one, Go, and he goes, and to another, Come, and he comes, and to my slave, Do this, and he does it. When Jesus heard this, he marveled at him, and turned and said to the multitude that followed him, I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith. And when those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave well.
Where would we like to start with this?
Well, this is continuing that issue I just mentioned about the kind of reciprocity of equals, so that the elders of the Jews come and they say he's worthy, right? This is a person who deserves your healing of his slave. And then when the centurion sends a delegation of his friends, he protests and actually behaves kind of like a bad Roman. He's not worthy. Don't bother. But you could still do it, by chain of command, and it'll happen. And so you don't have to come into my Gentile house or anything. Just, sort of the higher status person is putting themselves below. And I think it's part of that reversal motif of Luke.
I think, too, there's that element, as was mentioned previously, that Luke's audience is largely a Gentile audience, and the message of Luke's gospel is that God's salvation is for everybody. Here's a Roman centurion who is not of the people of Israel, but yet he is worthy. He's what Jews in the 20th century and 21st century might call a righteous Gentile. He is someone who has been favorable to the Jewish people and done something worthy to help them. And Jesus commends that. Again, here's something new to contrast, to go back to last week's program, the old and the new, that the new is breaking through the boundaries of nation, of race, of religion, of tradition, because God's will is for all people to be saved. Jesus says, not even in Israel have I found such faith. It's a very active faith. It's a faith that trusts, and it's a faith that is humble at the same time, realizing that perhaps he's just saying it, but I think he perhaps really believes that he is not worthy to have this great healer come under his roof, knowing that he is not worthy, but he does have the faith that draws Jesus, and that faith is always a part of Jesus' power and of Jesus' ability to break through into people's lives.
And this also sets, I probably at break here, but this also sets up a nice parallel. I mean, one is Luke does not have the story of the Syrophoenician woman who comes to Jesus to asking Jesus to heal her daughter or cast the demon out of her daughter. And many see this story as maybe a version of that story, or because it has a lot of similarities between it, and that story is not present in Luke. But even more importantly, this story sets up what we talked about all the way back at the beginning of the episodes of Luke, of the Luke show, is that Luke likes to parallel things between Luke and Acts. And so this story, for those of you who want to do a little more work and reading, is paralleled to the story of Cornelius in Acts 10, and another centurion who is sort of part of that story. So I think they actually are supposed to, in some sense, be read
for sure
synoptically.
One last thought before our break, picking up on the word worthy, which also comes up later, not worthy. Phil Van Linden, who wrote a fantastic commentary on Luke Acts, told me a story many, many years ago about he was once visiting in Europe, and all of a sudden he saw this, like, what he thought was a homeless man, and he walked up to him and he said, ¿Cómo te llamas? And he was wondering what the fellow was going to say back, but he said, I was so caught off guard when he said, Soy digno. Soy digno. I'm worthy. And it made Phil tell us how seeing someone that he was expecting a normal name, like all of us have, but to be given a word that indicates the dignity that one has. I'm worthy. It made him so aware that this is actually the message of Luke, that there is this understanding of we are worthy to receive grace. There is this possibility that this great Savior will be able to reach us. We are worthy to come into his presence. He is coming to us, making us worthy. And on that note, we'll take our little break. We'll be back and pick up with the widow of Nain. Stay tuned.
For over 25 years, KNXT has been serving the people of the San Joaquin Valley with good family television. That's just not available anywhere else. It's important for you, the viewer, to help support this valuable tool of ministry. KNXT needs to continue to grow and bring you important programming about your faith. But sometimes it's hard to stop and find the time. Make it easy. Go to KNXT-TV and find out how easy it is to support your Catholic television station, KNXT-TV.
Hello again, and welcome to the second part of our 8th program, where in chapter 7 of Luke, our favorite gospel this year, because it's the one we're proclaiming every Sunday, usually in the Roman Catholic Church, and also in many of the other Christian communities, in the Christian churches around town. They're preaching often on the same gospel as we are. I wonder if we could read what's commented upon, proclaimed on the 10th Sunday of Year C, the widow and her son. And Robert, can you share that story?
Soon afterward, he went to a city called Nain, and his disciples and a great crowd went with him. And as he drew near to the gate of the city, behold, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And a large crowd from the city was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and said to her, "Do not weep." And he came and touched the bier, and bearers stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." And the dead man sat up and began to speak. And he gave him to his mother. Fear seized them all, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has arisen among us, and God has visited his people." And this whole report concerning him spread throughout the whole of Judea and all the surrounding country.
What would we like to... Well, David, you're going to have to preach on this sometime. Where do you go?
Well, I'm struck by something that was said previously, and that is that Jesus' power was demonstrated in his actions before he would preach and teach. You know, there was always an activity of healing, and certainly in this spectacular event of raising this man who was dead, they all glorified God. So they got the message. It reminds me of the saying, "Actions speak louder than words." You know, our message of the gospel needs to always be followed up by deeds, as has already been said, you know, that our faith must issue forth in action and in doing the deeds of the gospel, rather than just talking about the beauty of the gospel or talking about what our faith is, but we live it. And Jesus certainly exemplified that, and this powerful presence of God in raising to new life. You know, I mean, the Paschal mystery, of course, the death and rising of Jesus is at the center, and so any of these encounters with God's power would always be life-giving in one way or another, and certainly, you know, and this very dramatically was seen in the raising of the widow's son.
This passage is really very nicely Lucan too, in that it's kind of foreshadowing the John the Baptist questions. It's going all the way back to the traditions of Elijah and Elisha, which are have miracle stories of children being raised, as well as the rejection of Jesus at Nazareth in the preaching in chapter 4, when he referred to Elijah and raising the widow back then, her child. And they didn't like Jesus' preaching then, but they seem to like it now. And I think it's important to the viewers to realize that I think in the modern world we have the tendency to think of the raising of the widow's son as a healing story. So the dead man is healed. And these are actually not really healing stories. The beneficiary of the miracle is really not the dead man, although obviously he is. He's not dead and now he's alive. The important line is Jesus gave the young man to his mother. And so these are what scholars call gift miracles. They're like the breaking of the bread, the multiplying of the bread, the miraculous catch of fishes, all of those stories where there is some benefit of the miracle is going to other people. And so this was a widow whose only son died. And obviously that's terrible, you know, the human loss of a loved one. But there's also economic problems, because in a patriarchal society, if you're a widow without a son, you have no future. You have no one to take care of you. And so the gift in that sense then is the restoring of her ability to have life after the death of her son. And I think that's an important element that Luke is emphasizing here.
Another thing that Luke does that we've mentioned, Robert's mentioned it, and Father David, is he'll switch from a man to a woman, from an Israelite to a Gentile. And sure enough, we just moved from this Gentile Centurion man to a Jewish woman being blessed. And with this compassion, as Robert said, it was for her that this was done, and that becomes clear in verse 13. when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her and said to her. Compassion, that same gift when the when the Good Samaritan is in that story, the question is, who proved himself neighbor? The one who had compassion on him. It's compassion that Luke is all about, and he shows it so concretely here. Anything else in this before we move on to our last two passages? Well, let's do that. Father David, if you could share a very interesting pair of narratives, John's question to Jesus and Jesus' words about John.
The disciples of John told him of all these things, and John, calling to him two of his disciples, sent them to the Lord, saying, "Are you he who is to come, or shall we look for another?" And when the men had come to him, they said, "John the Baptist has sent us to you, saying, 'Are you the one who is to come, or shall we look for another?'" In that hour he cured many of diseases and plagues and evil spirits, and on many that were blind he bestowed sight. And he answered them, "Go and tell John what you have seen and heard. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear. The dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them. And blessed is he who takes no offense at me." When the messengers of John had gone, he began to speak to the crowds concerning John. "What did you go out into the wilderness to behold? A reed shaken by the wind? What then did you go out to see? A man clothed in soft raiment? Behold, those who are gorgeously apparelled and live in luxury are in kings' courts. What then did you go out to see? A prophet? Yes, I tell you, and more than a prophet. This is he of whom it is written, 'Behold, I send my messenger before thy face, who shall prepare the way before thee.' I tell you, among those born of women, none is greater than John. Yet he who is least in the kingdom of God is greater than he." When they heard this, all the tax collectors and the people justified God, having been baptized with the baptism of John. But the Pharisees and the lawyers rejected the purpose of God for themselves, not having been baptized by him. To what then shall I compare the men of this generation? And what are they like? They are like children in the marketplace, and calling to one another, "We piped to you, and you did not dance. We wailed, and you did not weep. For John the Baptist has come eating no bread and drinking no wine, and you say he has a demon. The Son of Man has come eating and drinking, and you say, 'Behold, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners.' Yet wisdom is justified by all her children."
Thank you. We now have about 5 minutes to kind of like look at those two passages that Father David just read. They're separate, but they lead one into the other, and they're definitely focused around something about John the Baptist. Robert, what is something we really need to know that Luke is meaning to tell us here?
Well, I think Luke is really setting the old age and the new age with these stories again. Remember, in Luke is the only one that has John in prison already before Jesus gets baptized, and so he really wants to end the sort of time of the previous with and contrast that with the new that is Jesus. And so presumably John sends his disciples because he's in prison, and they then report back to him. And then that theme kind of continues in the contrast that is being made between John, especially when Jesus says, no one is greater than John previously, but he is in that old age, because now even the least of the kingdom of heaven is greater than John. So John is a transitional figure, again, kind of like Samuel in the Old Testament. We saw that with the Hannah connection and the birth stories. And so the important, culminating everything that comes up to him, but also then the sort of final preparation for, in Samuel's case, the new king that is ultimately going to be David, and in John's case, Jesus.
Father David.
Yeah, I think that this again shows the breaking through, as we've said before, of something new, and also the inclusiveness. I like this, the passages, verses 29 and 30 are kind of in parentheses in the text that I have. And when Jesus is talking about the baptism of John and the important role of John as a prophet, the tax collectors and the people justified God having been baptized with the baptism of John, but the Pharisees and the lawyers rejected the purpose of God for themselves, not having been baptized by him. So it's who's the in crowd and who's the out crowd. Now it's kind of turned upside down, because the Pharisees, those who were the religious professionals of the day, they're going to be on the outside, whereas the tax collectors and those on the margins, they are going to be included. And that's, again, an image of not only the universal nature of God's wish for salvation, but also people are going to make choices which are going to affect which side of the line they're going to end on. You know, we have freedom of conscience, free will. We can make a choice, and that gives us a real understanding that something new is coming. And it's not displacing the old, but some people from the old will prefer to stay with that rather than to come into the new, as we've used the image previously.
Yeah, and they like neither John nor Jesus, right? They think both of them are on the outs. And of course, again, in the Roman context, it ends very interestingly, right? Jesus is being characterized as a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. And again, in a reciprocal system, a friendship is only between peers, or you might hope to be friends with a superior, right, as a way of moving up. But Jesus is being accused, and probably a true accusation here, that he associates with tax collectors and sinners who would provide no benefit. And they're not peers, and by any means you're not able to move up with them. And yet everything is reversed, right? So the idea that moving up is a good thing is actually what's the problem.
I'm wondering if we should entitle this program A Reversal of Fortune, because it's almost that we're seeing week after week, and especially in this passage right here, this friendship. So I'd ask ourselves, who are we friends with? Whom is the church most friendly with? And you wonder if this isn't a good moment to examine ourselves, our consciences, and our own behavior. What are our friends? Tax collectors and sinners? Or those in prestige and fame and fortune? Let's look where Luke leads us next week. God bless.